Elias Ward found her at 5:12 in the morning, and the horse found her first. Moses was an old gray quarter horse who had lived through enough storms and strange seasons that almost nothing startled him anymore. He didn't pace when the wind came through the western slats. He didn't spook when the coyotes called from the ridgeline at dusk. But that particular morning he stood perfectly motionless in the last stall, ears pressed forward, dark eyes fixed on something near the south storage corner, and he had not made a single sound. That was the tell. Moses hid when something was threatening. When something was merely unknown, he watched in silence and waited for the man he trusted to decide what it was. Elias came in from checking the east fence line that the overnight storm had knocked half sideways. His rubber boots were caked to the ankle with clay mud. His shoulders were wet from the rain even through the coat, because the coat was old, and the lining had stopped keeping water out 2 winters back. He was 48 years old, a tall, broad-shouldered black man whose face the years had not softened but only layered, the way a good piece of wood gets worked by weather until it holds the marks of every season it has survived. His hands were the hands of someone who had done outdoor labor by necessity long enough that necessity and vocation had stopped being different things. He swept the flashlight beam in a slow arc across the barn floor following Moses's line of sight. The beam caught her in the corner near the feedroom door. She lay curled under an old tarp that someone, probably his late neighbor Dwight, who had used the barn for storage for a season 4 years ago, had left draped over the stacked bales near the south wall. The woman's knees were drawn up to her chest, her silver hair pressed flat and damp against the side of her face. One hand gripped a small leather bag tight against her sternum, the knuckles pale around it. Her feet were the first detail that made Elias stop moving. One black leather shoe, low-heeled and well-made, the kind that had cost real money when it was bought, and one white athletic sneaker tied with a red cord that was not its original lace. They were not from the same pair. They were not even close to the same size. She woke when the light hit her, not the way a sleeping person wakes. She pulled backward against the boards with a sharp, involuntary sound that he understood immediately as the reflex of someone who had learned, over enough nights in enough uncertain places, to respond to sudden light the way a wounded animal responds to an approaching footstep. Her eyes were open in under a second. There was no drowsiness in them. There was only the particular and durable exhaustion of someone who had not truly slept, deeply and without vigilance, in a very long time. "Do you need a doctor?" he asked. She pressed harder into the corner. "Don't call the police." He had heard that sentence before. He had said it himself once, though the uniform that time had not been outside the door. It had already come through it. He knew the difference between a person who said it because they were hiding something they had done, and a person who said it because experience had taught them that the arrival of authority was rarely the arrival of safety. The difference lived in the eyes, in whether there was calculation or just pure animal instinct, and her eyes held nothing strategic. They held fear and shame, and the flattened affect of someone who had been frightened for so long that it had settled into ordinary. He lowered the flashlight so it no longer pointed at her face. "Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Because this is one of those stories about what a human being chooses to do when they have every possible reason to look the other way, and what that choice costs and what it eventually returns." "You're in my barn," Elias said. "I know. How'd you get in?" "The back latch. It wasn't locked." He glanced toward the feed room. The rear latch had been on his repair list since the prior week, when the post had rotted through enough that the bolt no longer caught. He hadn't gotten to it. He looked back at her and took a proper accounting. Dried blood on the back of her right hand, a scrape along her left temple that had clotted and gone dark, the sleeve of her jacket torn at the elbow and soaked through with rain. Her face was the face of a woman who had been, at some point in her recent past, someone who attended to her appearance carefully. The remnants of that care were still visible, not in what was there but in the structure beneath it, the posture even in collapse, the careful way she held the bag. She had not always slept in barns. "Are you injured?" She looked at her hand the way someone looks at a part of themselves they have stopped monitoring. She shook her head, but the shake had no conviction in it. Elias exhaled. He could tell her to leave. He had reasons enough to fill a paragraph. An unknown woman, an unknown bag, a first sentence of "don't call the police," and the particular arithmetic of what happened when a black man living alone on the rural edge of a county like Bellwether was found to have allowed a white woman, unknown, apparently homeless, visibly distressed, onto his property, and the sorcery went sideways in any one of the dozen ways it could. He knew that arithmetic intimately. He had lived through what happened when the math went wrong and no one looked at his side of the ledger. He had spent 11 years paying the debt that calculation had assigned him. But it was still raining outside, and it was cold enough to find it in a breath. And the woman trembling in the corner of his barn was not performing anything. There was nothing in this that served her. She was just cold and afraid, and she had slept in his barn because the door had been broken, and she had needed to be somewhere out of the rain. He took the old wool blanket from the hook on the south wall and held it out toward her. "Wrap up, come inside, there's coffee." She looked at him as though a door she had been expecting to find closed was unexpectedly open, and she didn't trust it yet. "You're not going to ask who I am?" "If you're cold enough to sleep on hay next to a horse stall," Elias said. "Your name can wait until after the coffee." The kitchen was small and spare, and had the particular order of a place maintained by one person who had too little time and too much else to think about to waste emotion on conversation. A clay pot of rosemary on the windowsill, a stack of electric bills held down by an old horseshoe, a handwritten note on the side of the refrigerator that read, "Call Ruth about feed, fix West Gate," and a photograph faded at the edges and turned slightly yellow of Elias at perhaps 35, standing beside a girl of about 10 with short, neat braids, both of them caught mid-law by whoever held the camera, near a fence post on land that looked broader and more open than the property around this house. The woman sat with both hands wrapped around the coffee mug like it was the last warm object in the world. Her hands shook. He put a plate of toast in front of her. She said she wasn't hungry. He told her she was a bad liar. Something in the way he said it. Direct but without cruelty, without the cushioning tone people use when they are trying to manage a stranger rather than simply talk to them, made her take a bite. She ate slowly, like someone relearning that it was permitted to eat, in a room where no one was watching to see what she would do. The morning light was beginning to come through the curtains, and with it the kitchen brightened in gradients, and Elias Ward, who had spent 11 years learning to hold his face still in the presence of the things that had broken him, looked at the woman at his kitchen table and felt something rise in him from a depth he had believed was sealed. He knew her face. He would have known it in a crowd of 500 people, not because they had ever spoken warmly, not because their lives had touched in any way that involved care or recognition or anything approaching fairness. He knew it because it was the last face he had looked at clearly, in a room with fluorescent lights and wood-paneled walls and a flag in the corner, before the gavel fell and the door shut on 3 years of his freedom, his farm, his daughter's daily life, and his name in the town where his grandfather had first purchased land after many years of working other people's land for wages. "Margaret Vale," he said. The mug stopped moving in her hands. She closed her eyes. The name sat between them in the kitchen like something that had been waiting there for 11 years for the room to be quiet enough to hold it. 11 years ago, in courtroom 4 of the Bellwether County Courthouse, this woman had sat behind the bench in a black robe with her hands flat on a heavy folder, and had looked at Elias Ward the way a person with a full schedule looks at the next item to be processed. He had been 37. His wife, Diane, had died of cancer 2 years before, and he had never quite stopped feeling that her absence had changed the way the world oriented itself around him, had removed some protective layer that he had taken for granted. His daughter Simone was 9 years old. She had been sitting in the hall outside the courtroom with Ruth Bell, because Elias had needed her to be somewhere when the verdict came, and Ruth was the person in Bellwether he trusted with that. He had been accused of deliberately setting fire to the East Grain storage on Ward Ridge, the farm his grandfather had bought acre by acre over the course of a decade, and his father had expanded and improved. The land that Elias had worked since he was old enough to follow his father through the grass, and which he had run alone since the old man passed, and which he had refused, flatly and without apology, to sell to a developer named Harlan Price, who had come 3 times over 6 months with offers that kept rising and a smile that kept narrowing. The fire happened on a Sunday night in October. Elias had been asleep when Moses woke him with the alarm sound. Not a whinnying, but a series of short, urgent calls that the horse only made when something was genuinely wrong. He had gotten outside in time to see the north wall of the grain storage already burning, and he had spent 40 minutes trying to make sure the adjacent outbuilding didn't catch, and that the horses in the main barn were safe, and he had suffered minor burns on both forearms doing it. The fire department came. The county investigator came. They had walked the ground around the burned building and documented what they found. Tire impressions at the rear gate that did not belong to any Ward vehicle, an unmarked fuel container in the weeds outside the north wall, a point of ignition at the exterior rather than the interior. The first report had noted all of this and had not assigned blame. Then the second report appeared. The second report said the fire had been intentionally set by the property owner for the purpose of insurance fraud, and that the property owner had also been falsifying his mortgage documents, and that evidence of both could be found in financial records the bank had provided. Elias did not understand how those records had come to say what they said. He had not falsified anything, but the bank records were official, and the bank's attorney was organized, and his own attorney was a man named Downs, who worked out of a one-room office above a dry goods store, and had never tried a case this complicated and was doing his best in a courtroom where everything seemed to be moving faster than he could follow. Elias had a recording. He had made it himself on the afternoon that Harlan Price made his third and final visit to Ward Ridge, when something in Price's tone had changed from persuasive to threatening. Price had said, among other things, "The land doesn't love you back, Elias. It just sits there waiting for someone who knows how to use it properly. And if the right person doesn't acquire it the right way, sometimes the land just stops being available in any form." He had said it with a smile. He had then said, less carefully, "I'd hate to see you end up with nothing but a pile of ash and a judgment you can't satisfy." Elias had played this recording for his attorney. His attorney had submitted it as evidence. It was excluded on chain of custody grounds the morning of the second day of trial. The witness who had seen a truck leaving the Ward property by the rear access road on the night of the fire, a man named Darnell Okafor, who ran the rural mail route, had given a statement to the county investigator. By the time the trial began, Darnell Okafor had withdrawn his statement and refused to testify. He had not told Elias why. He had only said in a phone call that lasted under a minute that he was sorry and that he could not afford what testifying would cost him. Margaret Vale had presided over all of this. She had ruled on the admissibility of evidence. She had sustained the prosecution's objections and overruled Downs's counter-arguments. And when it was time to give the jury its instructions, she had given them in a way that left very little room for the ambiguity that Elias's situation actually contained. When she sentenced him, she said, "The court cannot allow sympathy to substitute for evidence. Mr. Ward, the record before this court supports the conclusion that you made a deliberate choice in a moment of financial desperation, and this court is obligated to respond to that choice with the full weight of the law." Elias had said quietly from the defendant's table, "You never let my evidence into the room." She had struck the gavel. He had been taken out through the side door, and the last thing he heard through the closing gap was the sound of Simone beginning to cry in the hallway, and Ruth's voice saying, "Shh, sweetheart, we're going to go somewhere warm." Now Margaret Vale sat at his kitchen table with her hands shaking around a coffee mug, wearing a torn jacket and mismatched shoes, and she said, "I didn't know it was your property." "No," he said. "I only knew it was rural and dark, and the door was open." "I know." She reached into the leather bag with both hands, carefully, and withdrew a waterproof document sleeve, the kind sold at camping supply stores for hikers who needed to protect paper in the field. Inside it was a set of folded pages with edges that had gone soft from handling. The top line on the first page was still legible. "State V is Elias Ward. He did not reach for it." "I found the suppressed filing," she said, "the original fire investigator's report, the recording of Harlan Price, a complete version, not the one your attorney submitted, an internal memorandum from the prosecutor's office, and a letter from a witness who was pressured to disappear." Elias felt his throat close. Where were they? "In the private archive of Judge Avery, my predecessor on that bench. I was asked after my retirement last year to assist in reviewing cold case files from the prior administration. I reached your file 8 months ago. You retired," he said, "and then you found me innocent." She did not flinch. "I'm not here to make that sound better than it is." Outside on the dirt road, a black pickup truck moved past the front of the property at a speed well below what any passing vehicle would travel. Slow enough to be witching. Elias was at the window before she had turned in her chair. He stood to the side of the curtain so his silhouette would not be visible against the interior light. "They've been following me since I left the city 3 days ago," Margaret said. The truck reached the small crest in the road and disappeared. Elias stood at the window for another full minute, not moving. Then he turned back to the kitchen. Who are they? People hired by Leonard Griggs or by Harlan Price or by both. Griggs is running for county attorney general. If your case is reopened and the suppression of evidence is established, his entire career collapses. And if Harlan Price's involvement in arranging the fire is documented, the 20 years of land acquisition he's built on the Ward Ridge transaction gets pulled up by the roots. Elias looked at her for a long time. He thought about Simone. 20 years old now, studying in another city, calling him on Sunday mornings with the careful affection of a daughter who loved her father, and had also spent her most formative years without him, learning to seal over the places that his absence had left open so that the cold didn't get through. He thought about Ward Ridge, where the farmhouse his grandfather had built was gone, replaced by Blessing Step. Not even the resort development that Price had promised. The project had collapsed in its own financial scandal 2 years after the land was taken, and now the ridge sat empty, the foundation block still showing his grandfather's initials in the concrete, the land itself overgrown and unsellable and not belonging to anyone who cared about it. He thought about a night in the county holding facility, 6 days before sentencing, when he had lain on a narrow mattress and looked at the ceiling tiles and counted them for the 4th time that week. Not because he wanted to know the number, but because his mind needed somewhere to go that wasn't the day before the fire, or the day after it, or any of the days in between. He picked up the waterproof sleeve. Do you have the originals or copies? Copies. But I know where the originals are. Does anyone else know they exist? The people who are looking for me know. The black truck moved past the house again, slower this time. Elias set the sleeve on the table. He went to the window, confirmed the truck had not stopped, and pulled the curtain all the way shut. I spent years learning not to open the thing that was taken from me every morning, he said. I did it so I could function, so I could be someone Simone could call on a Sunday without hearing a man still dissolving in his own past. Margaret said nothing. But they came onto my property tonight, with a truck and a container. He looked at her steadily. And you're sitting in my kitchen with 11 years of my life in a waterproof bag. He took his jacket from the hook. You can stay until the rain stops. Then you're going to tell me everything. Not as the judge. Not as someone managing the situation. As the person who signed their name to my file after reading a version of it that was never complete. She nodded. Her eyes were bright, but she was not going to cry in front of him, and she understood instinctively that he would not have wanted her to. Whatever was owed here would not be settled with tears, and Margaret Vale, she looked up. If you lie to me once, even once, the barn still has space, but this house won't. He did not wait for her answer. He went to call Ruth Bell. Ruth arrived 20 minutes later in the pale light of an early morning that was still more gray than blue. She stepped into the kitchen, took one look at the woman sitting at the table, and stopped moving entirely. Elias, I know. You tell me right now, he told her. The barn, the bag, the documents, the slow truck on the road. Ruth listened with the particular quality of stillness that very capable people use when they are absorbing something they need to respond to correctly. When he finished, she said nothing for a long moment. Then she turned to face Margaret directly. Do you understand what this man's life looked like after that trial? Ruth said, not what you read in the record, what it actually looked like from outside the courthouse. Margaret said, no, I don't think I do. He came into my place after he got out, Ruth said, sat at the counter, didn't order anything, drank 3 cups of coffee and went home. Did that for 6 weeks before I figured out he wasn't ordering because he didn't have enough money to eat and wasn't going to ask anyone to know it. I started putting a plate in front of him and telling him I was trying a new recipe and needed someone's opinion. She paused. His daughter's letters to him in that prison went from 2 pages to 1 page to a postcard to nothing, not because she stopped loving him, but because she ran out of ways to say what couldn't be fixed by saying it. Margaret held Ruth's gaze and did not look away. I'm not here to be forgiven, Margaret said. Good, Ruth said, because that's not mine to give. She sat down at the far end of the table and put her hands flat on the surface. Tell me what you found and tell me where the originals are. And tell me what we need to get this in front of someone who can't be bought by Harlan Price. They drove to the courthouse annex in the next county, where Judge Avery's archived files had been transferred after the building reassignment 2 years prior. Margaret's old access credentials still worked, which told them that whoever had moved to neutralize her had been thorough, but not thorough enough. No one had thought to scrub every administrative thread. The archive was in the lower level, climate-controlled and quiet, and smelling of old paper and industrial cleansing solution. They found the box by case numbers. Elias stood with his back against the shelving on the opposite wall, while Ruth and Margaret pulled the folders. He had spent 11 years living inside of stories that someone else had written for him. He had rebuilt what could be rebuilt. A smaller piece of land, a different kind of work, a relationship with Simone conducted within the damage rather than pretending the damage had not been done. He had not spent those years waiting for this morning because he had not permitted himself to believe it was coming. He had simply moved from one necessary thing to the next, because Simone needed a father who was functional even inside a diminished life, and because he understood that the alternative to functional was a kind of collapse that would finish what Harlan Price and Leonard Griggs had already started. He had thought about the recording in the early years. He had thought about Darnell Okafor's silence. He had thought about the pace of the trial, the fluency of the prosecution, the way his attorney kept arriving one step behind every ruling, and he had understood, not immediately, but within the first year after the sentence, that he had not simply been the unfortunate product of a flawed process. He had been the intended result of a functioning one. Someone had planned for the evidence to fail. He had not walked into a courtroom and lost. He had been walked there. Knowing that and carrying it without anyone willing to hear it had been its own kind of sentence. One that ran concurrent with the official one and did not end when the official one did. He stood with his arms folded and waited, not because he was indifferent to the contents of those boxes. He was not indifferent. His entire adult life was in those boxes, but the documents needed to be in someone else's hands first. He needed to receive this, not initiate it, because what was in those folders was not a weapon he intended to wield, but a truth he intended to deliver to a room that had once refused to hold it. The documents needed to be in someone else's hands first. He needed to receive this, not initiate it, because what was in those folders was not a weapon he intended to wield, but a truth he intended to give to the room that had once refused to hold it. The original fire investigator's report was there. It described tire impressions at the rear property gate, inconsistent with any Ward family vehicle. It described a fuel container with no manufacturer's label, which did not match the farm's inventory. It described the ignition point as the exterior north wall. Inconsistent with a fire set from inside by someone attempting to stage a loss. None of this had appeared in the documents submitted to the court. The recording of Harlan Price was there, complete, unedited, time-stamped. His voice was calm and even the voice of a man entirely comfortable with the conversation he was having. He said, "If Elias Ward won't accept a reasonable offer, then reasonable stops being available to him. Land that a man won't sell can always be made difficult to keep, and a man who's difficult to keep the land can always be made difficult to believe." He said, "We'll make sure the only offer he gets is a jail cell." The prosecutor's internal memo was there. It was from Leonard Griggs, addressed to his first deputy, and it said, "Do not disclose alternate suspect. Pursue Ward on existing evidence." The date on the memo was 4 days before trial. There was a letter from Darnell Okafor, the mail carrier who had been the key witness. He wrote that he had been contacted by a man he did not know who had told him that if he testified, the county assessor would be given reason to re-examine a property irregularity in his mother's deed that had been on Faisal since the 1990s. He wrote that he had told the police about the letter and nothing had happened. He wrote, "I am sorry, I knew what I saw. I didn't know the cost of saying it would be someone else's life." Margaret sat down on the floor of the archive room when she finished reading the Okafor letter. She sat down the way someone sits when the muscles of the legs simply stop cooperating. She had the file open on her knees, and she read it a second time, and then she looked up at Elias. He was leaning against the shelving on the opposite wall with his arms folded, watching her read. "Now you've read the case," he said. She did not attempt to answer that. Ruth made copies of every document. She drove to the public library and sent the digital files to 3 separate recipients: a civil rights litigator she had known for 2 years in the state capitol, an investigative reporter at a regional newspaper who had written about wrongful conviction cases before, and the intake desk of the federal district court. The originals went back into the waterproof sleeve and stayed with Elias. That evening, a local news outlet ran a story. The headline described Elias Ward as a convicted former property owner who was believed to be harboring a missing former judge whose recent erratic behavior had raised concerns among her former colleagues. The story mentioned, twice, that Elias had a felony arson conviction. It used a photograph of him taken at the Bellwether feed store 3 years ago, in which he was looking away from the camera and appeared, depending on what you wanted to see, either contemplative or guarded. The story quoted an unnamed attorney who described Margaret Vale as a woman experiencing a mental health episode that had made her vulnerable to manipulation. Elias watched the report, then crossed the room and turned off the television. Margaret said, "I'm sorry." Elias looked at her. "Stop apologizing each time you understand something new about what I've been living with. We don't have enough days for that." Late that night, Moses gave his alarm call. Elias was outside within 90 seconds. Near the east corner of the barn, where the old feed storage door opened onto the side yard, Two figures were moving in a manner that no innocent purpose required. One of them was carrying a metal container by the handle. Elias hit the exterior floodlight. The figures ran. They were fast, but the light was faster. He heard a truck engine starting at the far end of the property access road, heard the tires on the dirt, and then heard nothing. He walked across to where the metal container had been dropped and looked at it without picking it up. Margaret had come out. She stood in the barn doorway in the coat he had given her, looking at the container on the ground. Her face had gone somewhere that was not this yard, not this night. "That's how they did it," Elias said. She looked at him. "They left a container. Then the report said I must have left it myself." She did not say she was sorry. She was beginning to understand that the apology did not reach the place the damage had been done, and that the appropriate response to that understanding was not words but what came after. The petition was filed 11 days later. The civil rights litigator held a press conference. The investigative reporter published a 3-part piece. The regional story became a state story. Griggs retained outside counsel. Harlan Price gave a brief statement describing the situation as a politically motivated attack on private development interests, and declined all interview requests. The federal mediator who took the petition was a woman named Judge Carla Fitch, who had a reputation for conducting proceedings with the specific kind of patience that had no patience for theater. She held the hearing on a Tuesday morning. The room was not large. It held attorneys, reporters with credentials, and Ruth Bell, who had driven to the county seat wearing the gray coat she saved for funerals and moments of consequence. Elias sat at the table in a clean white shirt and his old jacket. He had not gone anywhere to purchase anything appropriate for the occasion. He was not costuming himself for an audience. He was simply present, which he had always been, in every room he had ever been permitted to enter. Griggs's attorneys cross-examined Margaret with the specific strategy of discrediting the messenger in order to avoid engaging the message. They asked whether she was currently without a home. Yes. Whether she had been under medical evaluation for cognitive decline. She said she had been told she was by people who needed her to be. Whether her desire to rehabilitate her reputation had influenced her reading of the documents. She said yes, and then she said, "But my wanting something doesn't make these documents false. It only makes me late." When it was Elias's turn, he was asked to describe his account of the original investigation and trial. He did so without editorial. He described the farm, the refusals, the fire, the excluded recording, the missing witness, the trial, the sentence, the years afterward, the property gone, the land abandoned, the way Simone's letters had changed, and then stopped, and then restarted again in a different register, the way people in Bellwether had stopped meeting his eyes in the feed store after he came back, not out of malice, but out of the discomfort of not knowing what to do with a man the record said had done something that everyone who knew him doubted. But the record was official, and their doubt was just a feeling. The opposing attorney asked him, "Mr. Ward, do you bear animosity toward former Judge Vale?" Elias looked at Margaret across the room. She was watching him with both hands flat on the table in front of her, not as a judge, but as a person who had made an enormous error in a room with bad acoustics and was now sitting with the full sound of it. "Yes," he said. The room held its breath. "But my anger at her doesn't make me innocent. The evidence does that. And if I had let my anger make the decision on the morning I found her in my barn, she would have died in the dark. And the men in this room with the expensive attorneys would still have their story." Judge Fitch ordered the full original trial record reviewed by an independent panel. She ordered the audio recording of Harlan Price entered into the state evidence database and referred to the Attorney General's office for evaluation. She ordered Leonard Griggs to appear before the disciplinary board. She issued a preliminary finding that the conviction of Elias Ward had been secured through the material suppression of exculpatory evidence, and she initiated the formal process by which that conviction could be overturned. She did not overturn it on the day of the hearing. These things require time and documentation, and the slow movement of legal machinery through channels designed not to move quickly. But she said it clearly, in language that would be quoted in 4 different news reports before the following morning. On the basis of the evidence before this court, Elias Ward did not set fire to his own property. Outside on the courthouse steps in the thin winter sunlight, Margaret found him. She stood about 6 feet away. She did not reach for his hand. She did not make any gesture that would collapse the appropriate distance between them into something more comfortable. "I was wrong," she said. "Not only because I was deceived. I was wrong because I believe the elevation of my position made me see more clearly than the person standing below me. I treated the haste of the process as thoroughness. I heard the record and never heard you. And I knew, when you told me you had not been allowed to bring your evidence into the room, that there was something unresolved in that. I chose not to sit with it." Elias said nothing. "I'll testify wherever they need me for as long as this takes," she said. "If that is all that's left of whatever I built, then that's what it gets used for. You can't give me back the years. I know, but you can stop them from keeping the rest of it." "Yes," she said, "I can do that." A few months later, on an early morning with the quality of cold air going blue, Elias stood in the barn with a brush moving slowly along Moses's back in the long, steady rhythm the horse preferred. The rear latch had been repaired, the new bolt solid in its post. The fields beyond the fence were quiet under the low gray sky of late autumn. He heard the car on the drive before he turned around. He recognized the sound. Simone walked across the yard toward the barn, with her hands in the pockets of her coat. And Eli watched her come the way a father watches a person he loves cross a familiar distance and tries to hold the image of it, because experience has taught him that these ordinary crossings are not ordinary and never were. She stopped near the barn door. "I read everything they published," she said. He nodded. "And," Simone looked at him, "I believed you before it was in print, Dad. I just needed the rest of the world to catch up." He held that for a moment. She came the rest of the way and put her arms around him, and he held on to her the way you hold on to something you once came very close to losing completely. Later that morning, Margaret drove out to the property and brought back the wool blanket, freshly washed. Elias took it from her. He hung it on the hook on the barn wall where it had always lived. She stood near the barn entrance, half in, half out of the morning light. "The barn isn't renting anymore," Elias said. She understood it was as close to a joke as he was going to get. "What about coffee?" she said. He considered for a moment. "Coffee is possible," he said, "but you pour your own." She walked toward the house. He followed at his own pace. Margaret Vale had once believed that justice was most visible from a height, that the bench, the robe, 3 decades of accumulated authority in a system that had always narrated in her favor, gave her a view of the people standing below her that was clearer and more complete than what they could see from where they stood. Elias Ward had stood below her and understood things about evidence and power, and the gap between a legal record and the truth of a life that she had never needed to learn, because she had always been the one holding the pen. 11 years went by. She lost the bench and the house and the reputation, and finally the last of the people who had found her useful. And she ended up in a barn, sleeping next to a horse, in the dark, in the rain, waiting for a door to open. When it did, the man holding the flashlight was the man she had sent through a different door 11 years before. He was not what she had made him. He had refused to become what she had made him. He had lived, steadily and without permission, through 11 years of a story that was told wrong, and waited. Not because he was patient by nature, but because there was nowhere else to wait. For the moment when someone with a stand to speak, it finally chose to say the true version out loud.